But I have the privilege of being here, which gives me then the opportunity to congratulate all of you on the exhibition that you've done, which I think is a complete triumph and such an important moment for all of us living in London. So many congratulations on that. And everyone who has contributed to the catalog, which obviously from the launch that we've just had will be very rich. And Rachel, I mean, to have organized this right now, this week, so that it is in tandem with the exhibition, and so that we have the members of the foundation still here in town, able to feed in directly to this discussion. It's really been extraordinary. So congratulations to everybody. Just so proud of all of you. And we've now reached that moment where we have the keynote. And we're extremely fortunate that it will be given by Lucy Bradnock, who has just returned to the Courtauld after sojourns to California, where she was involved with or a prime mover in the legendary Pacific Time project, and then was for a number of years at the University of Nottingham, but is back in London now, and did her doctoral work at the Courtauld, where she was working on a topic that has become an extremely important book on modern art after Artaud, No More Masterpieces. And this is relevant to this, I think, because Schneemann is a part of that research project, and she will then be able to develop it in ways that I know that we're all dying to hear about. So I will turn over to you, Lucy. Brad.
Thank you, Mignon, for that really lovely introduction. I'm going to try and not talk about Artaud today. He has been too long in my head. And thank you to all of the speakers today who've presented such incredible, rich, generous papers about Schneemann's work, and to Rachel and to Lotte for organising such a marvellous event to accompany Lotte's beautiful, powerful, splendid exhibition. I did not see nearly enough of it on Wednesday, and so I'm looking forward to going back often. It's really wonderful to see Schneemann's work in the space of the Barbican and to see it all together. And one of the things that I want to think about today is the way in which all of that work kind of operates together. It's a real honour to be concluding today's proceedings, particularly since it's one of my very first acts since I started here at the Courtauld last week. My head is spinning a little, which I think will probably show. And it's a real honour to be addressing those who knew and loved Carolee Schneemann well, but also those who might be new to her work. And in some senses, I'm really envious of anyone who's in that position. What a wonderful position to be in. So my aim in this paper is not to present new archival discoveries, or really to kind of focus on interpreting Schneemann's work anew. And I'm also really aware that it is 5:25. It's been a really intense day, and we have the promise of wine and pizza. So my aim also is not to provide some theoretically intense thing that you've got to kind of suffer through, I hope. What I want to explore is the ways in which Schneemann's own approach to writing about her work, and writing also about the work of others, embodied a kind of broader ethics of her approach to art making, but also art encountering. And I want to ask what we might learn from Carolee Schneemann as we encounter, interpret, and write about art. And probably as context for that aim, I should say that I've also recently taken on the editorship of an art historical journal, and so I have been thinking quite a lot about what this process of art history is. I've not come to any conclusions, so perhaps you can help me in the Q&A. To this end, I want to open not with a work by Schneemann herself, but with a portrait of sorts. At least a work in which Schneemann is physically present by virtue of being a subject and a sort of co-creator. That work is Eleanor Antin's construction Blood of a Poet box in the collection of Tate, an old specimen box containing 100 glass slides, each with a now quite faded blood sample taken by Eleanor from a poet friend or acquaintance in New York between 1965 and 1968. Schneemann appears as the 41st poet whom Antin solicited for her contribution. These are relatively recent new photographs that Tate took, and I'm now very sad that I didn't ask them to photograph Schneemann's slide, but she is in there about kind of on the list of names, about sort of 3/4 of the way down the left-hand column, sandwiched, as it were, between the New York poet Elaine Craft and the dancer-choreographer Yvonne Warriner, who is number 42. Each one among 100, Schneemann and the others participate in a group portrait of a cultural milieu, but one that was constituted one piece at a time. Even as Antin explores the locus of creativity in the body, each of her subjects is contained both physically, their drop of blood trapped between glass slides and held in place, the apparent antithesis, I think, of the messy tangle of Schneemann's neat joy. In 1972, parts of a Body House book, in the 1972 work Parts of the Body House book, Schneemann would list Antin and her husband David as among, and I'm quoting Schneemann here, those poets who understood best first what I made. And she moved in similar circles to them, albeit predominantly on different coasts. When Antin embarked on making her curious box, Schneemann had just published her Meet Joy notes as prologue in the journal Something, which David Antin co-edited. Granted, Antin's definition of poet is quite capacious in this work. Increasingly so, actually, as it progressed. She's explained that in part she included Schneemann and Warriner on account of the difficulty of finding women poets in the New York scene, seemingly another branch of the art stud club against which Schneemann would rail. Schneemann never really identified as a poet. It's well known, of course, that she resolutely insisted on her status as a painter, even as her work became more expansive and embraced a range of media and forms, and as she grappled, as others did also, with the terminology to describe the resultant combination of assemblage, painting, theatre, film, photography, drawing, people, words, and multiple other things. Indeed, when Antin produced another portrait of Schneemann as part of her series Portraits of 8 New York Women, she made a large wooden easel the central focus. And I'm showing you 2 iterations of that work. You can see the easel combined with a mirror, a red velvet throw, and a jar of honey with honeycomb. Antin's offered no explanation of her choice of those objects, and so we're kind of left to put together some amazing picture of Schneemann from them. And yet, of course, words run consistently through Schneemann's work, making her inclusion among Antin's poets less incongruous than it might at first seem. Those who study Schneemann's work, and there are so many in the room here, become very quickly familiar with her distinctive, slanting, occasionally spiky handwriting, which appears in, around, and alongside her images, actions, objects, and bodies, and with her idiosyncratic, fragmented, and often unpunctuated prose style. Schneemann's writing was published in little poetry magazines and in book form, read aloud to accompany the cavorting bodies in Meet Joy, excerpted and incorporated into collages and artists' books, projected onto her body and the bodies of others. And all the while, as is clear from the many boxes of her correspondence at the Getty Research Institute, and the some 500 pages of her published letters, Schneemann was a prolific correspondent. Her letters, like her published and unpublished essays, located very much as a part of her practice rather than a separate and distanced commentary. And I think that point that I think Cash made about how she kind of kept copies of her letters with a view to posterity is a really important indicator of the status that they held in her work. While Schneemann continued to insist on her status as a painter, it's telling that she chose another designation to convey her feelings about the act of writing. Speaking in a 2014 interview, she said, and I think those of you who are academics can probably sympathise with this at the beginning of the academic year, when the fantasies of summer writing have not yet materialised. Writing is so difficult. It's like a terrible kind of sculpture. Though phrased as a complaint, it is, I think, a productive one, for elsewhere Schneemann tended to use that word difficult to convey something worth working at, or working through, or working with. What did Schneemann mean when she described writing as a kind of sculpture, albeit a difficult and terrible one? To conceive of Schneemann's writing in concrete or material terms is certainly not a stretch. Indeed, scholars have been quick to note the collage-like nature of her fragmented language, the palimpsestic quality of her typography, and her handmade artist's books that layer, fold, and superimpose writing, and we've seen some very beautiful examples of those both in the Barbican exhibition and also on screen today. Treating words as one of many forms of materials that all come together in delightful visual and material malaise. These techniques, like many of her early constructions and her environments, might enact what Schneemann described as the fractured plane as event. The page often appears activated by the energy of Schneemann's prose, and she tended to return to add, change, annotate, and edit both her own writing and the writing of others. And again, we've seen that repeatedly over the course of the day-to-day, and we see it in the kind of themes and the returns and the revisitings that run through the Barbican exhibition. To read Schneemann's writing in sculptural terms might be to observe it in the dual tendencies towards reduction and accretion, writing torn away, overlaid, overworked. In the literature on Schneemann, valuable work has been done, including by many of those who have spoken today, to understand Schneemann's writing as an act of self-archiving, brought about by both desire and necessity, a desire to take control of her own history, and the need to do so in the face of indifference and imposed invisibility, or as iterative, implicated in Schneemann's presentation and representation of herself and her work, and as a generative force, often driving and shaping her work as well as documenting and reflecting on it. Those that have anthologized and published her writing, among them Christine Stiles and Brandon Joseph, have examined the way in which Schneemann's writing operated intertextually, articulating recurrent themes, motifs, phrases, and references across different moments, spaces, and media. What interests me today is less the material nature of Schneemann's writing, or its support, as Vicky so beautifully examined this morning, or its function as score or document for works of kinetic theatre, or indeed as disruptive of the categories and temporalities of score and document. Rather, I'm interested in... Is it echoing too much? I'm interested in the ways in which Schneemann used writing to chart and, more importantly, to enact a logic, or perhaps a semantics or an erotics of reciprocity that infused and informed her work more widely. In doing so, I want to argue that in Schneemann's hands, writing, though difficult, is an energetic act. That is, an act of energy transfer and transmission. even when it doesn't feel like it. And in thinking about the kinds of relations that her writing and the act of writing involve, to propose that her writing enacts a kind of reciprocity, and that that reciprocity offers us a model for art historical writing, or at least forces us to ask questions about our own position as we write about Carolee Schneemann and inciting her right with her. Brandon Joseph has argued compellingly that one of the most significant stakes of Schneemann's art is what he terms an ethical relationship to the other. That question of what's at stake inevitably shapes interpretations of Schneemann's work, particularly those that draw out its feminist and erotic politics, and that explore the tensions between the individual and the collective, or between self and partner. My interest in that ethical relationship that Joseph locates at the heart of Schneemann's work is focused on how it might be located in the coming together of image and writing to animate the relationship between artist and art historian. And I'm using the term art history here very broadly, as capaciously as Antin used that term poet, so I'm thinking about all forms of written engagement with her work. I'm reluctant to use the term art writing, which feels a little anachronistic when thinking about Schneemann. That is, what do we learn from Schneemann about the relational or reciprocal act of interpretation? Or to put it another way, what could art history look like after Carolee? One such instance of Schneemann grappling with the difficulties of writing about art was sparked by her experience of watching Yvonne Rainer's 1962 work, Ordinary Dance, at Judson Church. The work comprised simple, repetitive movements paired with an autobiographical spoken narrative that included a litany of the names of the streets Rainer had lived on. Just after seeing it, Schneemann penned a relatively lengthy written exposition of Ordinary Dance in a letter dated the 17th of June 1962 and addressed to the composer Philip Corner, who we've heard a little about from Cash, who had organised an event at the Living Theatre in which Schneemann staged her work Glass Environment for Sound and Motion. And my focus today on this particular letter isn't meant at all to imply that it's exceptional, so much as to suggest that it's exemplary among that vast body of writing. Forgive the slightly wonky photograph, but I think it's worth seeing this as reproduced in Christine Styles' anthology just for the kind of density of those footnotes, which gets at the kind of citational and illusionary practices that I want to talk about. This is the opening of the letter, which I've transcribed. Schneemann is writing, she explains, to assure you of what Yvonne will tell in other ways of Ordinary Dance. Before she interjects with a parenthetical acknowledgement of the fraught, perhaps futile, act of attempting to describe the word in writing, hopeless pause to word her images. In many ways, of course, Schneemann's pause points to the wider challenges of recalling and archiving works of performance that, as Rebecca Schneider has observed, present an ontological challenge to the logic of such impulses and structures. Having expressed an initial inability to describe Rainer's dance, Schneemann turns to the words of another, the poet Michael McClure, specifically his long poem Dark Brown, which had been published by the Our Hand Press in San Francisco a few years earlier. So she continues, and here, by chance, Brown of McClure fallen open for gold of that dance. Thus, in working through how to write about Rainer's dance, Schneemann turns to the words of a third party, as if projecting onto the poet the job of wording her images, introducing a step of remove as she grapples with the task, triangulating her own experience, and finding her way through the difficulty of writing by conjoining with the poem. Indeed, the excerpt that she cites, I expand the face, arm, nerve, muscle of myself to include myself. The step to fill is easy, oh, all unsimple, simple, oh, beaten darkness, huge and whole, seems oriented as much towards Schneemann's own struggle to express in words the experience of Rainer's dance, as it is intended as an interpretive scrim for the dance itself. And the quotation's opening line might supply a useful means of thinking through Schneemann's understanding of her own work as it expanded in space while retaining a focus on the surfaces and the spaces of the body, of her body. McClure's work of the late 1950s and early 1960s, dark brown included, invoked what the poet termed the spirit meat of the body as a means of escaping the obfuscating effects of lyricism and metaphor and accessing the deep erotic potential of the body's atoms and organs. It has a slightly different feel to parts of a body house, but I think that some of the kind of bodily impulses are not dissimilar. McClure's poem thus offers Schneemann a way of conjuring the body in all its messy, organic, muscular and sexual glory, via words that tumble across the page, exhorting a reader to envision herself a part of the massed audience that Schneemann described at Judson. That Schneemann approached the task of writing about ordinary dance as intimately connected to the erotic, ebullient body figured insistently in prose is indicated in her invocation later in this same letter. This is just a zoom in to that page of Styles' anthology, of a second literary point of reference, the figure of Molly Bloom, whose long unpunctuated soliloquy closes James Joyce's Ulysses and invokes for Schneemann the sort of charging forward into immediate time that she felt in Rayner's dance. She writes, and yes, 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 in allusion to the final lines of Molly's thoughts as she lies in bed next to her husband, the novel's protagonist, hero, anti-hero perhaps. This reference to Molly Bloom does several things, I think. First, it orients the pace and presence of Rayner's dance towards the erotic body and the question of sex. Second, it points to the possibility of language to both obscure and reveal the nature of physical or sensual experience, which takes form in the breathless quality of Joyce's stream of consciousness prose and the climactic nature of these final lines of his novel. Such is like paraphrasing of the final line of his novel. And third, it orients Rayner's performance and Schneemann's experience of it towards the future rather than the past. Her invocation of Molly Bloom comes as a counterpoint, as you can see, to this, or a self-correction to her initial impulse to read Rayner's litany of street names passed in relation to Proust's recollections in his. McClure and Molly Bloom might seem like odd bedfellows. This combining of apparently unrelated sources, though, is not untypical of Schneemann's gathering of allusions via reading that, as we know, ranged widely, very widely indeed. And we see evidence of that in the selection of books from her library in the Barbican galleries. But also the photographs of her annotated pages of her books that the Foundation has been sharing on social media, which is one of my most treasured Instagram threads. Schneemann would also cite McClure along with Antonin Artaud and French butcher shops as a core inspiration for her 1964 work Meet Joy. And I'm showing you an image of a copy of the typed letter to Jean-Jacques Lebel that's in Schneemann's archive at the Getty, since it shows the way in which she added, two-thirds of the way down the page, added Artaud to those other 2 points of reference, almost as if he's kind of serving to unite McClure and these French butcher shops. This is my, I think I mentioned Artaud, but I sort of love that huge capital letters afterthought. In citing McClure and Joyce, both authors known for their unusual approach to writing, Schneemann signals the need to rethink conventional language in order to account for the embodied experience of attending and attending to Rayner's work. Rayner's dance is difficult. Schneemann uses that word twice in this single letter, as is the act of writing about it, as is the act of writing in general. By extension, we might also describe the experience of reading Schneemann's writing about artworks as also difficult, not merely in the sense that she presents descriptions of sensations, energies, experiences, or the way in which she willfully, joyfully eschews grammar and conventional punctuation, but also in the sense that she doesn't give a reader easy answers, instead demanding that we engage with her in the difficult work of interpretation. I'm reminded of Susan Sontag's assertion that to read the work of Artaud, there he is again, is nothing less than an ordeal. Reading Schneemann is not an ordeal, quite so much as a glorious embrace of her wild, sometimes careering prose, which presents her ideas through the logic of surfeit, pages filled with allusion, abbreviation, shifts in direction, and terminology revised and revisited, as Schneemann grasps at and refines her ideas and desires for her work on the page right in front of our eyes. Certainly, as I have said, there's a collage-like quality to the manner in which Schneemann layers allusion, description, and citation in her writing. And again, I think just the kind of quantity and density of the footnotes in Styles' published letters is testimony to the kind of density of allusion that we find in her letters as elsewhere. They draw on an eclectic pantheon of heroes and heroines, past and present, and marshals them in expounding her ideas. I've suggested that Schneemann's turn to McClure and then to Joyce might have been the result of her difficulty to put into words her experience of Rayner's dance, and of course, as she suggests here, her belief in the cosmic coincidence of McClure's book falling open as she paused to collect her thoughts. But there's also something more deliberate to Schneemann's piling up of citations and allusion that might be understood by recourse to feminist thinking. For sure, McClure and Molly Bloom are odd bedfellows, but they also sit slightly ill at ease with Schneemann herself. McClure, whose darkly erotic poetry and beast language feels often deeply masculinist, despite his claims for a universal meat spirit, and Molly Bloom, who remains a silent entity for most of Joyce's very long novel, only to reveal her voice in tidal waves of run-on clauses that evoke the unburdening of a deep female sexuality long overlooked. Her voice, nonetheless, written by one of modernism's great masters. Though I do think it's telling that Schneemann refers to Molly Bloom without mentioning Joyce, or his central male hero, the wandering Leopold. There's an irony, and I'm not sure irony is actually quite the right word here, in Schneemann's choice of these two to explicate and animate her bodily experience of witnessing Rayner's also female body moving. And we might note her citation of other modernist men like Artaud, even as she was avidly reading Simone de Beauvoir and other stridently feminist authors. And yet, somebody, I think earlier today, described her as an ambivalent reader, and I think this really kind of gets at the heart of the eclecticism of her library. And yet, just as we receive no clear and straightforward outline of Rayner's dance in Schneemann's account, rather a series of really very loose and intangible impressions, so too does citation function as a passing impression, offered by cosmic chance or by fleeting appearance in Schneemann's mind, only to disappear again rather quickly. Schneemann emphasizes the personal, subjective, cluttered, contingent nature of her citational process. Things occur to her, appear presented by chance, fall open, and they disappear just as quickly in a surfeit of citations, repetitions, and rethinkings. For me, Schneemann wrote in 1963, the ideas I find are so thoroughly transformed by their life in my life, it is difficult to make clear the source. Direct quotation, in the case of McClure, or slight misquotation in the case of the Joyce, are subsumed into Schneemann's own unusual prose, wrenched from their context and put to work in the spirit of conjuring something beyond themselves. Schneemann would write to Jean-Jacques Lebel of the all-encompassing nature of her inspiration, explaining that, quote, any space, any debris, and any group of people would be potential structural form for me. While the passage in that letter pertains to her organisation of works like Meet Joy, we might also locate this expansive, generative, assimilative, perhaps, approach in Schneemann's encounters with works by other artists and other writers, and her use of writing, however difficult, to bring those experiences into her own insistently subjective, affective, and bodily experience. So it seems clear that it would be unwise to approach Schneemann's writing on ordinary dance or other works as straightforward documentation, description, or interpretation. Indeed, her account of the work complicates rather than clarifies, in parallel with a tendency in her work more widely to disrupt straightforward signification or representation, a repeated refusal of metaphor, and attraction to those works in which she discerned a similar impulse. The work is never symbolic, she would later assert. One thing does not represent something else. It's about transformation. In a similar manner, her account of Rayner's dance is not intended to represent the dance per se. Rather, I'd argue Schneemann uses the act of writing to bring Rayner's dance alongside her own practice and into a shared space that's also inhabited by McClure and by Molly Bloom, to find shared ground in the bodily experience that it brought about in her, and to locate it in relation to her ongoing concerns with the erotic body as a source of energy, force, and dynamism, that charging forth into immediate time that she writes about in her letter. Styles gestures towards this in her focus on the idea of correspondence, situating Schneemann's letters and the relationships that they delineate at the heart of her thinking. I go perhaps a step further than this, or perhaps just pick a different term, to suggest that what Schneemann sets up in her writing about the work of Rayner and about others is a kind of reciprocity in which both parts are enriched by a kind of coming together in Schneemann's act of writing about the work. Writing in Schneemann's hand is difficult because it's concerned with the business of dynamic union rather than distanced reflection. In some senses, Schneemann's engagement in writing with Rayner's work in dance reflects her desires for the audience of her own work. In her written notes to Meet Joy, Schneemann declares, "I wanted my audience to be an energy complement, enclosing and corresponding to the energy stream of performance." This sense of the performance encounter and experience as an energy stream emerges in Schneemann's invocation of Rayner's dance as colour and light. And I'm quoting from her here. She describes it as white and yellow, gold, lemon, and as time, some sort of charging forward. So that Rayner's work is reduced or perhaps expanded to physical forces that act upon things to generate change. Schneemann's writing functions as an extension of this energy stream, the energy complement to Rayner's work. She figures the work as almost alchemical, locating its transformation of energies in the body, which transformation in herself she describes and enacts in her letter to Corner. The notion of dynamic expansion in space had, as we have heard a few times today, had long shaped Schneemann's work as she moved from two-dimensional painting to three-dimensional constructions and environments. That spaces are activated by the presence of bodies, and their interrelation certainly is evident in these and her early kinetic theatre works. And the understanding of actor-audience relations as transformative would shape Schneemann's differentiation of her painting constructions and what in the early 1960s she was still sometimes terming her visual dramas, that is, the more immersive performance environments that she would later know as kinetic theatre. Articulating the different modes of viewing that the forms engendered, Schneemann wrote in June 1963, quote, "The force of a visual drama is necessarily more aggressive and immediate in its effect. It is projective. The spectator is overwhelmed with changing recognitions, carried emotionally by a flux of evocative actions, and led or held by the specified time sequence." What she described in her own audiences echoes her description of being at Rayner's performance, but her explicit articulation of the connections between actors, whether things or people or animals, as an energy stream was also inspired in part by her reading of the work of the Austrian psychologist Wilhelm Reich, an engagement that Annette Kubica has convincingly read as a response to prevailing depictions of the body that were, quote, depersonalized, ironic, sterile, theatricized, and curiously void of passion. Schneemann had become familiar with Reich's work in around 1960, and his emphasis on sexual inhibition as a means of permitting the flow of essential life energy was crucial in informing Schneemann's joyful embrace of sex in her work, her creation of works that depicted or invoked orgasmic experience, and her adoption of the vocabulary of energy flow and transfer alike. Kubica, Elisa Hias, and others have read works such as Meet Joy in relation to this interest in Reich, but we might also discern this orgasmic life energy in Schneemann's writing and in her descriptions of encountering the works of others. Reciprocity, of course, implies an equal footing. And for all that Schneemann's writing undertakes a relational and generative form of writing about Rayner's work, we might also locate in it the intersubjective tension that characterizes Schneemann's account of Rayner, and indeed to some extent also at times shaped their working relationship. While Rayner's yes, yes, yes is an additive and ordinary regularity of movement, one thing placed next to the other, one action happening after the other, for Schneemann, as for Bloom, one senses that it means something more climactic, more orgasmic, that many would not recognize in Rayner's work, even as Schneemann described the way in which ordinary dance resulted in what she called a bright, sensuous desire rolled out on the floor. Indeed, Christine Stiles, in her editorial notes to Schneemann's published letters, notes that Rayner objected to what she perceived as the messiness of Schneemann's Meet Joy, and left partway through. Rayner's sensuous, rolling desire looked quite different to Schneemann's. Towards the end of her letter to Corner, Schneemann writes, "A yellow and white box from a sense of wise dance evolving. The resultant work, Controlled Burning, for Yvonne Rayner's Ordinary Dance, comprises a hinged box that opens to reveal shards of glass and remnants of photographs, painted and partially burned. One of a series of works on display at the Barbican. It was really incredible to stand and look at it on Wednesday. A small, vicious, jewelled gift of a work. Its title indicated the recipient, notably as Rayner's dance rather than Rayner herself, that echoes the alchemical transformations that Schneemann evoked in her written account. Here, the aftermath of an energy transfer and transformation wrought as smoke stains on glass, wood, paint, and the suggestion of relationality or reciprocity suggested in the work's title, gifted to a work, not a person, and in the hinged format of the box, and the chain draped languidly from one side. We imagine its closure as an act that has the potential to bring materials into contact with each other. We might, following a paper earlier today, think about them kind of rubbing up against each other, with the possibility that this will bring crunching, scraping, further transformation. And maybe it was just me at the Barbican that stood in front of this work, attempting to map one side onto another to reassure myself that those parts wouldn't clash too catastrophically if the box closed, but all the while imagining that horrible sound of glass scraping on glass, which just kind of makes my skin crawl in an amazing way. Viewed alongside Schneemann's written description of ordinary dance, the construction suggests another way in which ideas, images, and experiences were, in Schneemann's words, so thoroughly transformed by their life in my life. So I want to conclude by asking that question I asked at the beginning then, given that kind of practice of engaging with the work of others, how might we learn lessons from Schneemann in our own writing? And so I return, this is a slightly worse image of this artifact that we saw earlier on, in part because I've also never seen this in person, but I did find a very useful YouTube video that flicks through every single page of it. So my apologies, this is a very low quality screenshot, but we can celebrate digitization of the internet. In an account of visiting Schneemann at her home in upstate New York in 2015, the writer Maggie Nelson described the artist's personal archives in terms that evoke the fraught nature of relationality, both real and imagined, or on the part of critics as much as Schneemann herself. Nelson writes, and she's talking about how at this stage Schneemann was quite old, and no longer really visiting the upstairs of her house, but welcomed Nelson to kind of go and poke around in the archival materials still housed there. So Nelson writes, also upstairs was a scrapbook I'd heard tell of, a binder with the label influence/plagiarism/I forgot. I'd heard that Carolee, this is still Nelson, I'd heard that Carolee kept a scrapbook full of clippings of work by artists she thought derived images, ideas, or impulses from her. When I poked around in it, however, it immediately became clear that this was no litany of woes, quite the opposite. It was an expansive elaboration of a morphological correspondence theory that drove Carolee for so long. This looks like this. This stems from this. It's interesting, it's a slightly different take on this work that we've heard today. On the one hand, of course, the existence of such a folder and its transformation into an artist's book suggests the difficulty of a career forged in a still patriarchal art world, where despite critical and art historical recognition of her work, Schneemann remained financially precarious until pretty much the end of her life. Nelson's fascination with it, and the fact that she was primed to look for it, that she had heard rumours of this folder, also conjures archival desires projected by researchers, critics, historians, keen to prove either Schneemann's pioneering status or to reassert the notion of the woman artist still bothered, still sentimental or over-emotional, or perhaps both of those things simultaneously, and it sort of relates back to that idea of those strange temporalities where she can be both a pioneer and also endlessly overlooked. But that final phrase, this looks like this stems from this, is crucial in other ways, I think, in the manner in which it disrupts the apparent objectivity of interpretation, classification, and analysis of influence and development by injecting these containing, often academic structures with the emotional force of envy, injustice, or just annoyance. It also recalls the disruptive force of the alternative set of analogies that runs through Schneemann's writing and speaking about her work, those that unsettle art historians or critics bent on medium specificity. Theatre is like painting, writing is like sculpture, dance is light, colour and time. And I'm very conscious of my own implication in this chain as an art historian, and also as an art historian citing Schneemann, citing Joyce, ventriloquizing Molly Bloom, and yes, yes, yes. So what lessons do we learn from Carolee Schneemann? I'm not, of course, and I hope this is clear, arguing for art historians everywhere to adopt the idiosyncratic style of writing that Carolee Schneemann proposes in some form of unfortunate pastiche. That is, my question is not how do we write like Carolee Schneemann. Rather, I'm asking how we might write in such a way as to retain the spirit, the energy, and the erotics of her writing. I'm advocating for us all to absorb the lessons that her writing about the work of others might offer. That to encounter a work of art is to become a part of its energy stream. That to write about a work is to extend and continue this energy rather than to impose an interpretation that freezes it. That writing about art should be reciprocal, figured as intercourse rather than observation, that it is embodied and erotic, fusing, expanding, energizing, and exploding. And that as we pepper our papers with citations, allusions, analogies, and analysis, we are no less subjective than Carolee herself with all of that personal clutter. And I was so invigorated to hear today's speakers reflect so beautifully on their own positions. I feel like this conference has been one of the most kind of self-reflective that I have attended in a really long time, and I think that speaks to Schneemann's influence and presence in the room somehow. If Schneemann stages the encounter with art as a physical, somatic experience and energy transfer, then she also demands an embodied art history, one that seeks to name and to harness the energy of the work instead of merely interpreting it. Her writing about artworks, her own and those of others, invites us to ask what it means to read and to write art history through the body. That is, as a corporeal undertaking rather than an intellectual one, or perhaps to acknowledge that the latter is inevitably also the former. As much as Schneemann acknowledged, even embraced the difficulty of writing that terrible kind of sculpture, she at times appeared to express little patience with that struggle in others. In Cézanne, she was a great painter. She decries what she terms the brittle academic voice of masculine authorities. Later, she even more explicitly bemoaned disempowerment of artistic activity at the hands of overzealous academic jargon. I think I'm guilty of all of this. It is especially difficult, she said, the more these enclosing terminologies establish themselves as irrefutable. You can't even talk about what you do unless you go through this nightmare of linguistic intervention. I'm doing a lot of writing now about these deformations of language. For instance, references to studio process as practice. Definitely guilty of that. I wrote an enraged letter once saying dentists have to practice, ballerinas practice, visionary artists do not practice. We enable, we enact, we realise. Also, we do not have careers. What language devils have evolved to substitute unpacking for research? I have a whole list of hateful language problems. I would love to know if that is a separate folder in your archives. If writing has the capacity to extend the energy stream of the work, then evidently it can also halt it, stultifying, neutralizing, disempowering. In her captivating essay Against Interpretation, Susan Sontag posed a similar perennial question about the stakes of writing about art. What would criticism look like, she mused, that would serve the work of art, not usurp its place? She elaborates on this imperative in terms of our experience of art accessed via writing. That is, and I'm quoting Sontag here, my apologies for not having this on a slide, The aim, and this is Sontag, the aim of all commentary on art now should be to make works of art, and by analogy our own experience, more rather than less real to us. The function of criticism should be to show how it is what it is, even that it is what it is, rather than to show what it means. To write about Schneemann is to pull at a thread that connects the body to the mark, to the word, to the world, via a writing that is embodied, erotic, and alchemical. And it feels that now is a moment when that kind of encounter and that kind of writing is possible for all kinds of reasons. It seems fitting to end this afternoon, not with my words, but with Schneemann's own, taken from her further notes on meat, joy, and kinetic theatre. They serve as a useful reminder of the embodied nature of looking, thinking, and writing, and that we are always implicated in a web of connections. She writes, "The body is in the eye. Sensations received visually take hold in the total organism. Perception moves the total personality to excitation. Insight is a result of sensation's creative action on our capacity to experience and discover functional connections. We are part of nature and of all visible and invisible forms."